Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome home to USA Global TV and Radio, where we provide world-class education, inspiration, and hope. I'm Dr. Jacqueline Kerbeck, and our show today is the Corner Bookstore. We are so thrilled to start off this new year with our first episode. Joining us is our guest from Vermont. His name is Tim Brookes, and we're thrilled that he's going to be joining us today because he has a wealth of information. He is a writer and he is the author of Writing Beyond Writing. He's also the founder of the Endangered Alphabets Project. Let's welcome him to the program and find out what he's up to. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
Nice to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for inviting me.
What do you think about us having this conversation here at the Corner Bookstore with the bookstore background and people walking around? Do you like it, or is it kind of confusing?
At first I thought it was confusing, but I think if we're sufficiently interesting, people will look at us rather than the background.
Absolutely. I like it. Well, we're on this new platform, so that's why we're trying it out. But anyway, let's get back to you. I loved having our chat backstage because I'm always interested in learning about things. You said something that really resonated with me. And I find that this happens a lot, especially here in the States, but of course, not just in the States, but everyone should look like us. Everyone should act like us. Everyone should speak like us. And you've decided to take a step out and say, hey, I want to address this. Tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. So about 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, quite by chance, I started doing something that wound up changing the course of my life and became my life's work. And that is I discovered non-Latin writing systems. So in plain English, what that means is ways that people around the world write that are not the same alphabet that we use, the ABC. And what I did as I began discovering these was I did something that perhaps is a little unusual. I started carving them in wood. And so I've got some examples right here. And for example, this one here, I'll hold it up and sort of scan because it's a vertical script. This is a form of writing that was developed by women in rural China. It's called Nushu, which means women's writers or women's letters. And women were not educated in that area. And it's possible that it would have been frowned upon, or they might have been punished if people knew that they were using it. But they created this really beautiful script, which they themselves call mosquito writing, or called mosquito writing, because every one of these has these kind of long legs, etc. And they used it to write amongst themselves within their own community, and to write about their daily lives and things that mattered deeply to them. And by and large, either men didn't know they were using it, or they kind of ignored it. And it's endangered because the last person, the last woman who wrote this fluently from birth actually died in the late 20th century. But there's sort of a revival now among calligraphers. And so to go back to your question, why shouldn't everyone be like us? Why shouldn't everybody do what we do and write the way that we do? Well, this is a perfect example of why a particular form of writing matters to a particular group of people. So this was their script, which they had created. They didn't have writing tools. They used soot to make ink. They used bamboo to write with. And so what you see in the way the letters are shaped is that entire process of struggle and marginalization and invention. Every letter, every word is a tribute to their overcoming that marginalization, the sense that they were denied this. And so if we were to go in there and say, you know what, you should speak English and you should write like us, what we're essentially asking them to do is to abandon their entire historical identity and to lose that that whole passage when they were communicating with each other with these characters, this calligraphy that they themselves had created. And one last point, because this was frowned upon or possibly even forbidden, one of the ways in which they got around that, I'm just going to pick up my carving again from the floor, was that they would embroider it, or they would write it on the panels of a fan. So as you can see, this is fan shaped. And that's because, first of all, they actually had fans, whereas they wouldn't have had paper. And secondly, if somebody came into the room, they could just close the fan and nobody would be any the wiser that there was writing on it.
That is really fascinating. I had not known or heard of any of that before. Thanks for sharing it. I want to welcome also Red O'Loughlin is here with us today. He's been watching backstage. Red, welcome to the program. And Red's been sharing a lot of information there in the private chat, some questions and some follow-ups. Red, what do you want to share with Tim?
Well, number one, thank you very much for joining us today. I apologize with I missed the training for the wave, and regardless, I'm here, but I don't have the right background. We'll fix that here as soon as we can. Several things I was going through. You were very kind. I thought we were going to be on last month, and you sent me a copy of a PDF on endangered alphabets, and I kind of started wandering through that and get kind of hooked a little bit. Yes. And in the process of looking at that, you kind of piqued my mind a little bit, because there's a lot of things in there. And some alphabets, like ours here as you talked about, the Latin, we go with sounds and letters, probably more sounds than, even though some of the letters, when you combine them into diphthongs, they have a slightly different one. But when we have earlier writings where they didn't do that, sometimes the writing was a word rather than a sound or something. And I thought that was kind of different. Why, do you know why we started shifting over to a more elaborate way of expressing ourselves from just words to sounds?
Ooh, you see, that's actually a very loaded question. And the reason it's loaded is because um, for the last, gosh, at least 300 or 400 years, there has been a tradition among thinkers in Europe and then in America that this must be a sign that writing in non-phonetic terms, in other words, writing that uses something other than symbols that represent sounds, that writing in non-phonetic forms was primitive or backward or childish. And this was really a circular argument, because what had happened at that point was that the European nations had by and large conquered most of the earth and were spreading the Latin alphabet. And so it became, wait a second, we rule the earth, we use this alphabet, therefore it must be the best alphabet. And what we're discovering recently and still sort of more and more is that many of these writing systems that use symbols, or what we would call pictures, or even other things like knots in string or things made out of clay, they are perfectly legitimate ways of conveying information using local materials that are in many ways very, very sophisticated, and in some cases more sophisticated in terms of the things they can do with them than the way we write, which is, as you say, to indicate the way that something should be said. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to keep on reaching under the floor and picking up pieces of wood during the course of this conversation. So here, for example, so in Ghana, the Adinkra symbols are symbols that were originally probably cut out of wood or other materials and then stamped onto clothing, but typically ceremonial clothing for very important people for ceremonial purposes. And each of these symbols, it's not a letter and it isn't a word either. So, for example, we're used to looking at, say, Egyptian hieroglyphs and saying, this is a picture of something, but it means this word. So these are something different yet again. These are proverbs or items of wisdom that that were made, and I'll explain why in just a second. So here is one, and this is another of my carvings, and this is a symbol that consists of two crocodiles, and they're not lying across each other. They actually have the same stomach. And the term for this, or the word for this, the phrase that describes this symbol is Siamese crocodiles. They're joined at the stomach. And what this means, it's kind of a proverb, really. It means, why should we compete or fight or squabble with each other when everything is going to the same stomach anyway? And so as a result, it's sort of a symbol that promotes community and cooperation. And the way this would have been used is that if a particular chieftain was going to be wearing a ceremonial robe to a particular gathering, an important occasion, then those robes would be covered with these symbols, and they would often act as a kind of biography or autobiography, in that the qualities that are suggested by these symbols are the qualities that that particular chieftain had. And so as the chieftain turns up at this gathering, everybody can tell not only that this is an important person, but these are the qualities that they embody. Interestingly enough, the Maori in New Zealand do something similar with tattoos. So when a person has achieved a certain kind of notable achievement, then there'll be a particular tattoo which will go on their skin. And so when you see somebody, you can straight away understand, yes, this is an important person for this reason and this reason and this reason. And so that's why this book is called Writing Beyond Writing, because all of these forms are ways of visually communicating information, but they don't necessarily use writing in the sense that we do.
So you almost wear your own PR press release.
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
And so when you're talking about that, sometimes you have different languages because the country has been overrun culturally over time. I was in Bulgaria, and some of the signs are in Cyrillic, some of the signs are in Latin.
Yep.
But the pronunciation is the same.
Yep.
And I guess in Chinese and Mandarin and the other language over there, I can't think of it right. You have the same word, but it's pronounced differently. So that people can understand if the writing is there, what it says. So that's my understanding. I've been there, but I've never actually delved into it as much. So you have lots of different situations where things are unique to that culture. You say them a certain way, and then over time that culture either goes away or expands and adapts something else. Now, you talked about hieroglyphs just a second ago or a moment ago, and sometimes our languages die away culturally because of whatever. Hieroglyphs has kind of died away, but in reality, we're starting to see a lot of things nowadays on, I guess, social media. We have LOL, laugh out loud, and we're kind of taking and making our own language for the technology that we're using. So as things devolve, they're also evolving too. And I think that's kind of interesting in a way because we're taking advantage of putting little memes or little faces or whatever it may happen to be. So we're kind of going backwards in some areas and kind of going forward in other areas.
Well, that's actually a really interesting point that I talk about quite a lot in the book. As I mentioned earlier, there was a widespread belief. It was presented as fact, but it's a belief that these more pictographic forms just kind of went away, or they were supplanted by others that were somehow superior or more useful. First of all, no language or script ever just goes away. It's invariably the result either of, as you mentioned, one culture overrunning another, or one culture being so economically superior that its neighbors have to sort of pretend to be it. So, for example, if you're in Bangladesh, and you watch television, then much of the television is from India, because India is the more prosperous nation, and the more you watch the high-end commercials, the more they have words or writing in English, because again, that's the more prosperous. So the assumption is, if you want to succeed, you should act like, or use the language of, or use the writing of this more successful community. But what you say about emojis is really, really interesting, because there's no doubt that, especially in Western culture, there was this kind of division that began probably 2,000 years ago, where writing went one way and art went another way, even though the Greek word graphos means both writing and art, but they sort of they separated. And what's more, we assumed that any writing that used art was inferior. So children's books use pictures, but that's because they're for children. They don't know any better. That's how they're going to learn. And as soon as smartphones became available and emojis became available, everybody started using emojis, because emojis in one keystroke can say a great deal more than you can say in a whole bunch of keystrokes if each one is an individual letter. And not only that, but some of them excuse me, some of them express emotions that are actually quite hard to put into words, but bam, you've got a face, you've got it there. So what you say, I really agree with, which is that this fork in the road, which happened a couple of thousand years ago, in some respects, there's a reconvergence coming back together whenever we start using writing in our sense, and graphics or infographics or emojis, because both have different kinds of value, and both working together are extraordinarily powerful and effective.
Okay, hieroglyphs use a form of art, I guess, as the case may be, pictures, etc. But you also have runes and cuneiforms and other things that are just kind of evolving. And you mentioned knots a while ago. Who would even think that knots could even be a language? But in reality, I'm amazed at your book. I really and truly am. And I did a little bit of extra research on YouTube, looking at some of the other things that are out there. And you really captured my attention. I just want to let you know that you developed. I have a bit of a passion for languages because I've traveled extensively around the world. But it's just one of those things that you never have anybody to practice with. You don't understand why things happen. And you kind of provided that extra level of spark and a little extra gas that, hey, I now have a place I can go and do some research and enjoy the little nuances that are there. But I think we see in some of our TV shows, somebody discovers a rune someplace or some other word or phrase, and nobody knows anything about how to interpret it because that civilization doesn't exist. But you said the writing exists because it's captured that moment. So how do we go about communicating what some 5,000 years ago? How do we go about interpreting it? Is AI going to be of some value for us and trying to figure that out?
Red, you just asked 17 questions.
Pick one. Pick anyone.
Yeah, right. All right. So I'm actually going to start with the last question you asked, which has to do with AI. And as everybody knows, there is a tremendously passionate debate, a lot of concern, a lot of enthusiasm right now around AI. And for example, teachers are saying, how am I going to know if my student has actually written their paper? And my girlfriend, for example, who works in higher education, discovered that there are AI platforms that will turn out professional communications. Anybody in business, for example, say, for example, you're in fundraising. Okay, AI has written me a pitch letter. I can send that out. I don't need to do the work. So I want to step back here for a second and say, what is writing for? And one of the great things that I've discovered in my journeys around the endangered alphabets is that in many cultures, or at least up until very recently, writing has been for some very different purposes than what we use it for. One of the influences of printing, for example, in Europe and then obviously in Americas, has been to say, oh, writing is about creating information that can be infinitely multiplied and infinitely distributed. And obviously the internet does that even more so. You can distribute it more cheaply, and you can distribute it to far more people. And the fact is, those are industrial virtues. Writing in many cultures has other virtues that are completely different. And I'll give you an example. On January the 23rd, I am inaugurating the world's first Endangered Writing Day, World Endangered Writing Day. And the reason why I'm doing this is because in my research for my book, Writing Beyond Writing, I discovered that in traditional Balinese culture, okay, Bali, Indonesia, we know about that. In traditional Balinese culture, on one day a year, the day that was consecrated to the goddess Saraswati, who's the goddess of knowledge and wisdom and writing, by the way, on that day, everybody would take their books, which are traditionally made of palm leaves. So these are oblong rectangles of palm leaf that are written and then bound together with a cord. So they would take these books and they would take them down and they would dust them off and they would repair them if necessary and venerate them and put them in a little household shrine dedicated to the goddess Saraswati, because they are so important. Many of these books would have been sacred books. Some of them also would have been books of more kind of secular value. But their attitude toward books is these are vital. The ability of writing to take one person's thought and use it to affect another person's thought is of spiritual exchange. So that's what they did. So as I was reading about this, I was thinking, we don't do anything like that. We have no such veneration of writing. We take it so much for granted that it's just used for everything. It's like linguistic duct tape. And so I've invented this day, World Endangered Writing Day. And during the course of this day, January the 23rd, we're going to have a whole series of talks and discussions about the very questions that you've been bringing up. In fact, we actually have an expert on the Andean quipu, which are the knotted strings that convey all kinds of information, who's going to be talking about them. We have people talking about kinds of writing that don't use letters. We're going to have people talking about the efforts to revive endangered minority script in countries where they've been banned or they've been marginalized. And when you think about AI, you think AI assumes that writing is a chore. And so AI finally is the robot that we can get to do our writing for us. Okay, we have robots on automobile assembly lines making our cars for us. AI is the robot that will do the writing. And that assumes, as I say, that writing is a chore. In many cases, we've actually lost the pleasure and the joy of writing as an art form or even as a form of communication. So our small children still have that. They draw a picture, they write mommy or daddy on it, they give it to the parent puts it up on the fridge, which by the way is a form of publishing. And they are using writing as an individual expression of whatever it is they're thinking and feeling, and it becomes a gift. So I am promoting this idea that writing is a gift, not in the sense of, hey, it's a gift. Some people have it, some people don't. But it's a gift in the sense that it enables me to give something of myself to you and to anybody who reads it. When you think of writing like that, you don't want AI, right? You don't want some machine to come in and say, oh, I'll do that for you. You say, no, this is mine. I'm going to do this the way I want it.
Yeah. I use AI as a tool and not as something to express what I'll say. But you talked about Balinese, so I guess that National Library Day in the United States doesn't count the same way. But getting back to the main thing and point, when you started looking at the spiritual end of things, way back when 2,000 years ago, you had the original collection that became a Bible that was in Aramaic and ancient Greece. And what I'm seeing in some of my studies is, they used a certain word back there and meant that in that culture. But that word has evolved through the translations from Greek to who knows what. And we have the same word, but it doesn't mean the same thing in our culture today. Take the word love. You got 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of saying the word love in Greek, but we don't have the same way of interpreting or understanding. We talk about our Father's love or a love of plants or whatever, all those things. But in our language, we kind of take one word and make it mean a lot of things, as opposed to back there, it was very specifically a certain way. So when we start interpreting some of these languages from a long time ago, how do we know that it's just really and truly only what it was today in our interpretation or what it was 4,000 years ago. We don't.
Yes. So what you're talking about, and every point you make is fine, is language. I'm especially interested in the same questions, but as directed specifically at writing. So yeah, there is this really interesting question of um, what did it mean to somebody to make a particular shape or a particular symbol at a particular time? And what I find really, really interesting about that question is that even if we're able to say it means this, we don't have the background that brings all of its meaning together. So, for example, if I show you the crocodiles again, right? So, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that this symbol was created in a country that has crocodiles, right? This isn't just a metaphor. This is a real thing. They've seen crocodiles, going after food. Secondly, one of the things that fascinates me about this symbol, and I'll hold it up again one time so that you can look at this, is how many interesting kinds of symmetry it has. It's actually symmetrical. Whoops, where's my hand? Right? It has that vertical symmetry. It has some symmetry this way. It's also kind of symmetrical, going around in a circle. If you think about proverbs in the English language spoken out loud, it's really interesting how often they will use techniques such as alliteration or assonance. They will have one phrase that then repeats itself slightly differently. So we're actually using symmetry in sound. So, for example, there's a proverb from the north of England which goes, "Many a mickle makes a muckle." And a mickle is an Old English word meaning little, and muckle is an Old English word meaning a lot. So it's like count your pennies, and the pounds will take care of themselves. But many a mickle makes a muckle. You've got all those M's. You've got mickle and muckle rhyming each other. You've got M. So it's really interesting to look at the ways in which some cultures have taken that sense of wanting to convey a kernel of truth, and they have made it visible in their writing forms. And again, that's something that we don't do in the Latin alphabet at all. And it's another reason for my crusade, which is to regard all of these forms of writing around the world with respect and to regard them as equals. So not to say, yes, that hasn't developed yet, or that's inferior, or that's inefficient, or whatever, but to say this is a product of a people who have developed it and who have used it as the expression of their collective wisdom, as is true of their art or their music or their dance. And their writing is valuable, actually priceless, for exactly the same reasons.
You mentioned sounds a brief moment ago, symmetry and sound. And I'm thinking one thing that clicked in the back of my mind was during World War II, we used Navajo communicators because Navajo was basically an unknown language in the world, and they could communicate from one Navajo to another and never have to worry about encryption or keywords or anything
Exactly.
else.
Yep.
And I'm sure that's probably been around. I guess a long time ago, they used to shave the head, tattoo something on there, let the hair grow back out, and then send them out as communicators from one place to another. I think it was China and some of the other places over in the Far East. So sound, even though it's not writing, is a communication, and in some cases, a very valuable communication. And I think,
yeah. So, and there's actually an interesting but much less upbeat parallel in writing. So, in North Africa, for example, the Amazigh people used to inhabit North Africa all the way from the western borders of Egypt to the Canary Islands. And this is before we had, specific countries along that coast. The Amazigh are also known as the Berber people. And they gradually got more and more overrun. First the Romans, then the Arabs, then the French. And nowhere do the Amazigh have their own country, even though they actually, in Morocco, they're a majority rather than a minority. What has happened up until very recently in several of those North African countries is because if somebody wrote in the Amazigh script, which is called Tifinagh, if somebody wrote in that, nobody who wasn't Amazigh could read it. And so they were very suspicious. What is it that this person is communicating? Are they plotting? Are they trying to overthrow the government? And so there have been laws passed specifically prohibiting that form of writing because those in power couldn't read it and didn't understand it. And in fact, I heard just yesterday from an Amazigh friend of mine that somebody in, I think it was Algeria, wanted to name their child Amazigh, which of course is the name of the people. It's a name of honor. And officially they weren't allowed to use that name. It's like a banned word. So this issue of the importance of writing, and especially the relationship between writing and culture, is also about power. So the powerful are the ones who make the rules, and one of the rules they may make is this is how you're allowed to speak in terms of language, and this is how you're allowed to write. And in fact, you've heard the phrase, history is written by the winners. So I've sort of extended that, and I say history is written by the winners in the alphabet of the winners.
My daughter's a deputy sheriff, and she gets involved with a lot of writing, but it's writing for fact, what happened. And I guess we think back to Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Right.
Yeah. But, when she started, she would get reports from other people. It was a dark and stormy night. Well, that had nothing to do unless, the crime was committed outdoors and everything's wet. So sometimes we write and we want to express all those emotions around us because it's important in our writing. But sometimes all we need is just the facts. Yep. And we don't need that other stuff. And sometimes we add that extra stuff or choose some words to obfuscate that thing that we don't really want to say, or we just want to distract from. So in writing, you have so many different ways of going. And as a reader, hopefully we are intelligent enough to understand what that person was saying. But in some cases, even though it's said, I didn't understand that from what he said, we get that all the time. So part of our education as a reader is to learn more and more about what writing is all about, because a lot of us never have a chance to really write.
That's very true. And just to bring in one other very, very sort of current debate that people are very passionate about is the whole issue of cursive. Is cursive an endangered alphabet? Is cursive English an endangered alphabet? And it's such an interesting thing because I personally was taught cursive in a rather brutal manner, and I didn't enjoy learning to do cursive. But the practice and the repetition means that you then have a form that you can use for expressive purposes, and it can look elegant, or it can look scruffy, or it can vary depending on your mood. It's sort of a self-portrait the way you write. I had a student, an intern, a couple of years ago, very, very bright kid, incredibly skilled at various things that I can't do at all. And one day, my printer broke down, and we had to address a bunch of envelopes by hand. And so I gave him half, and I had half. And I started, writing the names and addresses on the envelopes. And I looked over, and I had done 12, and he was on the first one. And he was very laboriously trying to make the letters the way they should be. And it looked really amateurish. And I had to say to him, I don't want my nonprofit sending out letters that look so poorly written. And so he apologized, and he sweated and he busted gut doing this. But unless you actually practice, then just something like getting a rhythm, or making the letters the same height, or anything like that, it becomes a very painful, conscious effort. So I personally am all in favor of certain kinds of like rapid communication, here's my smartphone. But equally, I'm all in favor of kids being taught writing in art class so that they actually realize that writing is a manual art. Before it's something that you do with your thumbs, etc., etc., that is an opportunity that writing offers us. And if you don't have that, you've lost something incredibly precious.
The end of our show, you have a program coming up on the 23rd. You've talked about a little bit. So how do people get in touch with you? How do they sign up for the show? And who is a good client for you or a good contact? So I'm going to give you the last minute here to take care of it.
Okay, great. Yes. So the first place to go probably is endangeredalphabets.com. Very straightforward. Endangeredalphabets.com. You can learn a lot about all the things that we've done in the last 12 years. You can buy a copy of my book, Writing Beyond Writing. And it will also link you to the site where you can sign up or register free for these talks on World Endangered Writing Day, January the 23rd. If somebody feels like sponsoring us, we love that kind of thing, and we have far too little of it. So again, you can get in touch through the website, endangeredalphabets.com. There's a contact link. And if you just have questions and comments, we would always love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much, Tim. We have QR codes that are here on the screen for anybody who wants to get in touch with Tim directly. We also have the one there on the Endangered Alphabets. And I appreciate you sending me a copy of your book. That was very, very generous of you to do that. And let you know that I'm not all the way through it, but I have made a deep dive into it and really and truly enjoying it. So again, many thanks for that. And I look forward to us talking again in the future. I hope your show on the 23rd of January is an absolute success. And I got to go over and see what my schedule looks like because I would like to be part of that. So
wonderful. All right.
Tim,
thanks so much.
Tim, thanks very much again. And here we are closing out the Corner Bookstore. We had Tim Brookes on today. Great conversation. Talked about many, many different things. And so we will be on again. Usually this is four times a month. We're in the process of New Year changing things a little bit. So tune in again and find out when the next show is. And I'm going to go ahead and close out the show because it's that time. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Again, for USA Global TV and Radio Network, Greta Laughlin signing out.